Summary of the Wednesday Wars by Gary Schmidt. Holling finds out that his 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Baker, doesn't like him on the first day of school. Because he is the only Presbyterian student, she gives him a dark look and tells him that he will be in school on Wednesday afternoons instead of going to catechism or Hebrew school. That afternoon, Holling walks home to the perfect house and chooses to get his parents to help him. His parents tell him that no one hates someone for no reason. However, Holling's dad also tells him that the Baker family might hire his architecture company to remodel the Baker Sports Emporium, so he shouldn't do anything that would make Mrs. Baker dislike him. The next day, Holling is scared that Mrs. Baker is out to get him. During break, Doug Swiatek's brother makes Holling play soccer with him. Holling trips Doug's brother and notices that Mrs. Baker seems upset that her attempt to kill him failed. Mrs. Baker makes Holling do work around the classroom every Wednesday afternoon. He hates it, but he knows what his dad told him not to do. In one Wednesday, Mrs. Baker tells Holling to get trays of pastries from Mrs. Biggio, the cook, for a later meeting of the wives of Vietnam soldiers. Holling goes outside for break. Holling puts them in order under the window that is open. In the afternoon, Mrs. Baker gives Holling a box of erasers and says he can have a cream puff if he cleans them. He hits the erasers against the wall outside and then sees that the chalk dust will ruin the cream puffs. It's too late to save them though. The next meeting is a disaster, and Mrs. Biggio has to go to the hospital because of the chalk dust. That night at dinner, Holling's dad yells at Holling's sister Heather for being a flower child and says that Holling ruined the cream puffs. Mrs. Baker says she will make you another cream puff the next day. This makes Holling's friends angry, especially Mighty, Meryl Lee, and Danny, who say they will kill Holling if she doesn't bring in cream puffs. Mrs. Baker tells Holling that they will read Shakespeare the following Wednesday, but only after he cleans out the cage where her pet rats, Sycorax and Caliban, live. Holling does what he's told, even though the rats scare him and everyone else. But he thinks that Shakespeare is just a way to bore him. When Mrs. Baker says that Shakespeare isn't meant to bore students, Holling looks away from the rats in shock. Sycorax and Caliban get away, and not even Mr. Vendlary, the guard, can stop them. Holling finds the Merchant of Venice exciting, even though Mrs. Baker is trying to bore him. In November, Holling's mom finds a leak in the living room roof, and Mrs. Baker gives Holling The Tempest to read. Holling loves the curses in the play so much that he decides to learn them all by heart. He practices early one morning at school and finds that Mrs. Baker has read the play, even though he thought she wouldn't have given it to him if she had read it herself. Holling is having a good time on his way home from school until he comes across the bakery and remembers that he owes his friends cream puffs. There is an offer for him to work for Mr. Goldman in exchange for cream puffs, but Mr. Goldman says he needs a boy who knows Shakespeare, not someone to work. So, Holling gets a part in a play of The Tempest, and Mr. Goldman gives him a box of cream puffs. Their plan goes wrong when they get into the box during break when Holling takes them to school. Even worse, Holling's dad won't give him an advance on his pay, and by the end of the week, he only has enough money to buy 5 cream puffs. But Mrs. Baker surprises Holling by getting the class cream puffs. In the afternoon, Mrs. Biggio comes in crying. It turns out that Holling's husband died in Vietnam. All of the teachers' rooms are decorated for the holidays except Mrs. Baker's. It's not very holiday-spirited for Holling because he has to play Ariel in the holiday extravaganza. Ariel is a fairy with a silly outfit. It looks like things will get better when Mrs. Baker says that Yankees player Mickey Mantle will be signing baseballs at the Baker Sporting Emporium. But Holling's excitement goes away when she tells the class that they can get extra credit if they also go see Holling in The Tempest. Holling is shocked to see Danny, Mighty, and Meryl Lee crying in the front row after the show. The dressing room is locked when Holling's dad is supposed to be there, but he doesn't show up. Holling has to use the bathroom. Holling is still dressed up as the bus driver drives her across town and even gives her a new ball. The player tells Holling that he doesn't sign balls for boys in yellow pants when Holling asks him to. Danny drops the signed ball after seeing this exchange and Holling get hit hard. They will be mean to my tea for 3 days, and Mrs. Baker will make her children work hard. Mrs. Baker sends Danny, Doug, and Holling to the gym with new tools and balls on the last day before break. People from the Yankees, Joe Pepitone and Horace Clarke, are there. The players give the boys tickets to the first game of the season. Doug then forgets about the joke he was going to play on Mrs. Baker. The local paper puts a picture of Holling in The Tempest on the front page. When Holling gets to school, he finds that Doug Swiatek's brother has stuck hundreds of the pictures up all over the place. That night, he tells his dad that he should switch to a military school. Heather later says that military school is silly because Holling would have to go to Vietnam anyway. Holling whines that she doesn't need to worry when Mrs. Baker tells her that the shame will go away. He sees what he did wrong. Lieutenant Baker, her husband, is fighting in Vietnam. 2 days later, Holling goes back to school to take achievement tests, even though the power is out and the weather is bad. That afternoon, Holling dotes on his sister as an out-of-control bus slides on the icy roads, saving her life. He is taken to the emergency room by Mrs. Baker and Mr. Gwareski, but Holling's family doesn't show up. The perfect living room's roof falls in on the day that Holling's family is getting ready for his dad to accept the Chamber of Commerce Businessman of the Year award. Holling doesn't like Romeo and Juliet at school, but he knows that Mrs. Baker and his friend Meryl Lee do. He takes advantage of this by asking Meryl Lee to go on a date with him on Valentine's Day. One night at dinner, he finds out that Meryl Lee's father, who is also an engineer, is closing down. When Holling tells Mrs. Baker that he can't afford to take Meryl Lee somewhere nice, Mrs. Biggio gives him tickets to see Romeo and Juliet. Following the play, Holling draws her a picture of his dad's plan to fix up the junior high school. There is a meeting the next week between the school board, Hoodhood and Associates, and Kowalski and Associates. Holling's dad takes him. Holling figures out that Meryl Lee lied to him. Mr. Kowalski's design is an exact copy of Mr. Hoodhood's design. Holling avoids Meryl Lee for a few days, but he soon learns that she didn't mean to betray him. After giving her a rose, his dad brags about getting the job, which makes him wonder if his dad ever had the chance to be the person he wanted to be. During the following week, Mrs. Baker learns that her husband is missing in action. He reads Julius Caesar in the spring and knows that bad things are going to happen on the Ides of March, when the school board is going to watch Mrs. Baker and Coach Quattrini is having cross-country tryouts. Holling runs on the weekends to get away from the fight that is starting between his dad and sister. He doesn't believe Mrs. Baker when she says she will train him, but he finds that she helps him run faster. In the end, she shows him an Olympic medal she won in 1956. Holling now knows that he thought she had always been a teacher. Up until Sycorax and Caliban fall from the roof onto Mrs. Sidman's lap on the Ides of March, the observation goes pretty well. Only she and my tea don't run away from the rats. Later, during tryouts across the country, the rats get away and chase Holling, who sets a record in the area. Bus hits the rats, and kids start making fun of my tea for standing up to them. Mrs. Biggio makes my tea a Vietnamese treat and says she's sorry. Mrs. Sidman becomes the director after her brave act. Holling makes the varsity cross-country team, and he is scared of the kids he ran with in 8th grade. As Holling and Meryl Lee work on their homework one afternoon, they learn that Martin Luther King, Jr. was killed. The Yankee Stadium opens for the season the next day. Holling tells his dad that he promised to drive him to the game, but his dad doesn't show up the next day. Holling has a great time at opening day thanks to Mrs. Baker's offer to take her. Holling's dad tells Heather that she won't be going to college after spring break because it's too risky. They don't go to Holling's first cross-country meet, which he wins with the help of Meryl Lee and Mrs. Baker. He also gets a $100 savings bond. Holling's school does atomic bomb drills all through May. The fights between Holling's dad and sister get worse until the sister finally runs away to California. Holling tells Mrs. Baker that she should call him by his first name so that it doesn't sound like she's talking to his dad one Wednesday. She tells him about the past of buildings as she drives him around and says that becoming an architect might not be a bad idea. When they get to the Catholic church, Holling asks if hiding under desks will really help in case of an attack. Mrs. Baker says it won't happen, but being ready makes people feel better. Heather calls that night from Minneapolis. She is broke and by herself. She is told to go to a Western Union. Holling pays off his bond and sends the money to his sister the next day. Holling's parents won't pick her up at the New York train stop, so Mr. Kowalski gives her a ride into the city. Mrs. Baker finds out the next week that her husband is still alive and will be home soon. Holling sees his parents break up as June comes along. Holling and Heather go to the Catholic church to light candles and cry with other people after Bobby Kennedy is killed. Mrs. Baker takes her class camping the following week. Holling is supposed to take a pack of cooking tools and chili up the hill to the campsite. Later, Mrs. Sidman finds out that he dropped all the tools. The kids are having a great time until late that night, when it starts to rain. The next morning is sunny and warm, so they swim for most of the day. Holling thinks that Mrs. Baker also wants to go swimming. That night, Mrs. Biggio comes over with cooking tools and makes a Vietnamese dish for dinner. She later asks my Teet to move in with her. After a week, Holling and his family go to Danny's bar mitzvah. He talks with his father about what it really means to become a man because Holling feels like he's seeing Danny grow up. Some weeks later, when Lieutenant Baker finally gets home, Mrs. Baker's whole class is waiting for him on the tarmac.
About the author. Gary Schmidt was born in Hicksville, a small town on Long Island. Some parts of the Wednesday Wars are based on Gary's own life as a child in Hicksville, New York. His 7th grade teacher had rats as pets, his teacher stressed how important it was to diagram lines, and Gary wasn't thought to be very smart. He didn't do well in school until a concerned teacher stepped in and encouraged him to love books. Schmidt became an English major at Gordon College and graduated in 1979. After that, in 1985, he got both a master's and a PhD in medieval literature. After that, he got a job as an English professor at Calvin College, where he teaches classes in creative writing and books for kids. In 1979, he married fellow author and Stickney Schmidt, and the two of them had 6 children. They wrote a book together about faith, prayer, and writing, and passed away in 2013. Schmidt's books Lizzie Bright and The Buckminster Boy and The Wednesday Wars both won the Newbery Honor, which is given to the best children's books. Schmidt teaches at Calvin College and also sends students to jails and detention centers to teach writing. His experiences doing that led to the writing of his 2015 book, Orbiting Jupiter.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.